So then we have C-428. And this is going to be a big celebration party of legislation here. But C-428, MP Rob Clark decides that it's time to repeal the Indian Act. And the way he actually put it, he came to the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations when I was there, walked in and said, "This is my bill. I'm going to provide the solution for you people to help lift you all out of poverty." That's the arrogance by which they think they know what's best for us. This act sounds like it's very benign. He says, all I'm doing is getting rid of the old education provisions. All I'm doing is getting rid of the old estates provisions. Well, first of all, we're in a truth and reconciliation process right now. There are people telling their stories about residential schools and Indian Act education. We're supposed to, out of respect for those survivors, wait until they're done their process for them to tell us what they want to do with those provisions in the Indian Act. I've never heard of anything so disrespectful than to forego what they might want with those provisions and to say how it's going to happen and just repeal them. And more than that, you've got a situation where, does everyone know what estates is? It's essentially wills after you pass on how you transfer your property. What he's going to do is he's going to take half of the estates provisions out, leave all of the intestacy provisions in there, and that just means what happens when you don't have a will. So you'll have a dueling battle between the provincial government being able to decide what happens with all of your property and the federal government being able to decide. And by the way, they're not going to recognize bands' abilities to legislate in that regard or pass band bylaws. And just for good measure, they're going to take away the power of bands to pass bylaws to prohibit alcohol on reserve. Some First Nations in this country are dry. You're not allowed to sell alcohol. If you want to have it, you have to buy it off reserve. They're taking that power away. You will get drunk and you will like it. That's essentially what they're telling people. How did they get half of us to sign the treaties? Has anyone ever read the treaty minutes? Some of our treaty negotiators lost their lives during those negotiations. Not only were they signing documents after they were long drunk by the treaty negotiators, but they also set dogs on them. They threw stones on them. Some of them lost their arms and legs. So when I hear Canadians go, we're all treaty people, really, you want to stand up and defend that behavior? You want to call yourself a treaty person? Then people had better stand up and live up to the obligations under those treaties. But we all know that the real objective of this bill is to repeal the Indian Act. Rob Clark has taken it upon himself as a private member to say, I will decide what's good for you and when it's really up to First Nations to decide when they want the Indian Act to go, how they want it to go, what it will be replaced with, and when they want to transition into that spot. Because they fool people into thinking, we all know how awful the Indian Act is. We know it's paternalistic, it's oppressive, it's colonial, it's caused a lot of problems for our communities. But there are also other things about the Indian Act. It acts like a placeholder. It protects our reserves from provincial encroachment. It protects our treaty rights on reserve. It protects anyone from taking those reserve lands. It prevents provincial expropriation for mining and development and pipelines. The second you take that away, watch how close or how quickly Enbridge lays a pipe across your community. So there's things in the Indian Act that keep the federal government on the hook, and I don't think they get to jump off the hook whenever they feel like it. So we'll keep rolling, one bill after another after another. So Bill S2, it sounds like a really good bill, and this is how the Conservatives work. They sell a bill with a really good name to it, so that we think, well, yes, of course we want to support this bill. Look, family homes on reserve. This is about equality for men and women. What chief in their right mind would be against equality for men and women, and after you divorce, everybody gets half? Who would be against this? But that's not what this bill is about, obviously. This bill does not recognize any First Nation bylaws in this country that already set out their own matrimonial real property laws. So the first thing it does is it says we don't recognize your lawmaking power. So it's an attack on our sovereignty. The other thing it does is, for the first time in history, it's going to give legal rights to non-Indians over homes and lands on reserve. Now, if you're a remote reserve and everybody marries from the same community, that's not going to be an issue for you. But the majority of First Nations in this country have a moderate to high outmarriage rate, some of them as high as 80 and 90%. I wonder how quickly non-Indian people will catch on about how quickly those lands can transfer. And there's no requirement that you be married 20 years. This stuff can happen in 6 months. And just in case First Nations leaders don't like this, here's what happens. Here's a scenario. A non-Indian wife can accuse her Indian husband of abuse. No arrest, no charge, no evidence. And a judge, without having to notify the First Nation, can say, I'm going to give you occupation of those house and lands indefinitely. So think about how much we're already overrepresented in prisons. Think about how much we already suffer discrimination at the hands of the legal system. This adds to it. This does not apply to any other Canadian citizen. Every other Canadian citizen has the right to know the charge against them. You have a right to defend yourself. Not here, not for our Indian men and women. The judge will also have the power to extend that person's possession of home and reserve lands for their entire life. So if you think there's housing waiting lists now, if you think there's not enough land on reserve now, when this comes in, that'll change everything. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with intermarriage. We're treaty partners. We live here together. We do intermarry. That's a good, healthy thing. That's what you do with treaty partners. But that doesn't mean that they get to take the lands that are protected under our treaties that were reserved exclusively for our First Nations. You know how much reserve land's left in Canada? 0.2% of all the land we've ever owned is now in a little tiny reserve. If you put all of our reserves together, it'd be smaller than Vancouver Island. You mean to tell me there's not enough land in the rest of Canada for them to fight over, and they can't leave our little tiny piece of land left? It's ridiculous in my opinion. But the justice system and our prisons are just going to get worse under this First Nation Elections Act. And you think, what? How could it possibly get worse? Because this bill, First Nation elections, would lull you into thinking that this is about elections, right? That this is about extending terms for our chiefs so that they're not constantly in elections every 2 years. You can be elected every 4 years if you want to. But it's not about that at all. What they're actually trying to get at are all of those communities who protest illegal elections, or elections that aren't run properly, or elections against their custom election codes, because some communities don't do elections, they do elder processes. So anyone who protests or raises any issue about a problematic election in their community, you can go to jail for a very long time and pay up to $5,000 in fines. So talk about silencing the voices of First Nations in this country. Who on earth would ask for something like this? And if you don't like the election, there used to be an appeal process at Indian Affairs. Now you have to go to the province. Provinces are going to be deciding our fate. That's what this bill does. And just to make it extra special, even if you do have a custom election code, and the purpose of a custom election code, for anyone who doesn't have one, is to get out of the Indian Act election provisions and write your own code. That means Indian Affairs doesn't get to appeal your elections, they don't get to have anything to do with it, you're in complete control of your own elections. But under this bill, if the Minister of Indian Affairs, without any evidence, decides, you know, I don't like that new chief. I think he's corrupt. I don't like the new councillor on there. he will have the power to impose this new bill on that First Nation and create their own election codes and completely replace them. And if you think that's beyond the realm of what would actually happen, look at what happened to the Algonquins of Barrier Lake. They stood up against resource extraction from their communities, they held protests, and so what did Indian Affairs do? They removed those customly elected officials and put their own in. And so there's multiple ways of dealing with protests from First Nations, and they're going to use the Election Act to deal with that. But here's the tricky part. They're hoping to lure First Nations chiefs into this, because under the Indian Act, if you want to have your own custom election code, you have to have a community vote. Everyone has to agree on it, at least the majority. Under this bill, if you want to get into this new fancy bill, only Chief and Council have to pass a resolution. They don't even have to ask the people. And that's not something that Chief and Council asked for. That's something that Indian Affairs put in there. And you think, why would Indian Affairs put that in there? Aside from causing divisions, because then you're trapped. Because the only way to get out of it is if you do a community referendum. So it's Chief and Council in, community referendum out. And we all know how costly community referendums are and how hard it is to get majorities at many of these meetings. So this is really about new ways to imprison our people for exercising our voice at very problematic community elections. Yeah. Okay, so Bill S8, First Nation Water. I feel so nerdy that I even know any of this legislation. It means I watch a lot of CPAC. But anyway, so this First Nation Water, again, it's another bill that sounds like safe drinking water. Who on earth is going to go and testify before the House and say, we don't want safe drinking water? Right? We all want safe drinking water. What's the issue with why we don't have safe drinking water and sanitation like the rest of the country? It's funding. That's all it is. It has nothing to do with legislation. But this legislation is very, very particular. What it'll do is it'll give the federal government all of the power to set up the rules and regulations around water and sanitation. It'll give them all of the power to force Chief and Council to do whatever it is they say is necessary on water, but no funding. And here's the rub. They will tell Chief and Council, you must fix your entire water system. And if you don't have any money, we're going to take it from your band operating funding formula that you use to pay social assistance and housing and that kind of thing. And if we screw up, because we're going to hire our own contractors to do it, you can't ever sue us. We're going to indemnify ourselves. We're not liable. And if you don't agree, you will go to prison. So now we have all of these pieces of legislation creating many new ways for us to go to prison. Like there isn't enough already, but now they're going to create more. The other thing it does, and you'll notice, I may not have mentioned it with the other legislation, is that it transfers jurisdiction and incorporates provincial laws on reserve, which is not entitled to happen for reserve lands as it is right now. Oh, maybe we should go back just for a second.